and welcome to another CTRM Radio podcast from Commodity Technology Advisory, hosted on CTRM Center, your place for everything CTRM. And in this episode, I talked to ValueCreed's Mark Chalmers about software selection, implementation, and all of the issues around that particular topic. We could have talked for hours. In the end, we talked for about 20 minutes or so. And I found the conversation extremely interesting, as I'm sure you will do too. Here's Mark Chalmers. So when it comes to selecting a CTRM, it can be an extremely complex question, particularly if you're not familiar with what a CTRM does. So what is your best advice to someone who says, how do we select a CTRM from scratch? And how do we make sure that we actually get the right result?
I think the most consistent advice that I would give is to use a selection partner. And obviously that is, talking up my own shop in a certain respect, but the reality is that, this is a technological niche and there is an enormous amount of information about the course of the implementations, about suitability that you simply can't find by either, doing your independent research or by, even getting demos or something along those lines. But also then once you get into the idea of actually using a partner to help you select, there are also then different flavors to the type of partner that you use. So there are a lot of companies that do, more management consultancy type work.
Yep.
And typically they're very strong at doing, the high level business strategies, which trading markets you have a competitive advantage in, what you should be doing for those. Companies that have more of a grounding in the actual applications, that do things like managed services, that do the implementations, typically they have a lot more information when it comes to some of the non-functional things that need to be considered. The tech, is it legacy? How hard is it to maintain? How hard is it to deploy? How hard is it to change? When you look at the market right now, especially in gas and power in Europe, there's almost constant regulatory change. There's constant changes in the nature of trading as well. A lot of companies are moving to, shorter term trading and so on. You need to have some view of the underlying system to be able to advise on that. And I think, that's where ValueCreed is quite strong because we actually own all of that application side. But the other piece of it is, though, when you, and again, I think this is something that is very consistently true across pretty much any trading company, is that when you are looking at a system, the first thing that you should do is go back to the business rather than looking or jumping straight into requirements. Go back to the business, think about the strategy that you want to roll out. Go to each of the different teams and ask them, sit with them and work out, what do you guys need to be doing tomorrow,
Yep.
in a year, in 3 years, and try and build up from there, rather than backing it out from a concept of what the requirements of the system should be. So I think that's very important. It's very important for a number of reasons. One is on the projects, what you don't want to happen is to get 2-3 months into deployment, having gone through contract negotiation, finding the right SI to help you deploy, and suddenly realizing that trading actually have some very nuanced requirement that cannot be fulfilled by the system,
Right.
because that's pretty catastrophic. It's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to delay the project. And typically those are the things that delay a project. So our approach is always to really get back into, the business strategy and try and build up from there. And we found that very successful. I mean, we have one company that we did a system selection for, I believe it finished in October last year. And they are about to go live. I think they're in UAT already for that system, for an ETRM. And again, because we had that period of going through in a very robust way, what are the actual requirements for this? It made the project a lot smoother. And that's not to say that there wasn't nuance that came up in the project that we had to deal with, of course, and you always have that. But at least, if there was a relatively detailed starting point that they were able to work from that just accelerated the whole thing. So that's a very long answer. But
That's fine. It's raised a couple of questions in my mind, which is, to what extent would you recommend someone looks at the business in terms of the exceptions as opposed to the traditional business processes? Because quite often I think you find that companies operate in a certain way and they have these little ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And those are the sticky points, are they not,
Yeah.
sometimes? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a balance because on the one hand, there will always be people on a project who say, I want that widget to move from there to there.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of being a good implementation partner to say no, in some cases, because all you're going to do is create a load of technical debt for something that isn't really required.
Yeah.
There is also an element of, challenging the business and saying, this is how the system works. It'll work better if you guys amend your process. Um, but equally, the balance to that is the overarching uh, challenge, I guess, in all of these processes is change management. And what you don't want to do as well as, changing a system is throwing, a massive curveball at the business and saying, well, also, by the way, besides changing a system and some of the ways you work regardless, you also have to change your business processes fundamentally. So it's about striking a happy medium, which again I think gets back into finding a partner with a decent understanding of the actual functional side of this, the
Mhm.
business, but then the application, because we will know whether that change is complex, if that change is going to entail a large amount of coding or also if the system can handle that. I mean, you look at Allegro and some of those systems have been so over customized that they barely function. And that's terrible. Then you end up spending an enormous amount of money creating a load of tech that just doesn't really function anymore.
Right. I guess another thought that crossed my mind as I was listening to you is plainly companies that are engaged in this, they've got people that have worked with the system before, they've got some sort of list of systems in their mind right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
What I would be concerned about is that there's some vendor out there with a product that they've never heard of that actually does the job a lot better than anything
Yeah.
they're familiar with.
Yeah.
And that's why I think a third party that's knowledgeable about the range of products in the marketplace can really
Yeah.
bring value. Would you
Absolutely.
agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially in gas and power, there's a huge amount of innovation that's going on right now. You look at Provise and Orchestrate, two very strong systems that are getting a huge amount of market share right now in that space. You have a lot of other interesting companies like Molecule. We met another one called Qualia last week, which is a sort of open API, very flexible system. Um, it's part of our job to make sure that we're current with these systems so that when we meet someone, we have in our head from the marketplace, who is likely to be a fit for their requirements. Because I think, I mean, if you've been around the industry for 10, 15 years, and, you did gas and power trading, particularly in that period, you're probably doing it on Endor or Allegro, realistically. Maybe some of the other systems that are even older, that is probably not a fit for a large part of the market. So walking in with those preconceptions about what the market is right now is definitely dangerous. It's a dangerous first step, especially again, you look at Ion, it's just not prioritizing Allegro right now in terms of even putting them forward for a lot of opportunities that historically they would have. And that's again one of those non-functional considerations that you have to kind of have in your mind too.
What role does the demonstration play in a selection exercise? And is it overemphasized or underemphasized?
Ooh, tough one. I would have said overemphasize in the fact that most people just say, just come in and show us the system,
Yeah.
which is a terrible, terrible way of doing it because what will happen is they will come in and show the shiny things, a flow that really makes sense in their system and the way they've thought about the world, rather than doing a really objective assessment of what the flow is going to look like for that trading company. And those are going to be two very, very different things, almost inevitably. So on the one hand, it's overemphasized that people think it's the be all and end all. But on the other hand, it's really critical because it's where the rubber hits the road. It's where, in our process, again, you have that kind of assessment of the business status and strategy that progresses into requirements that then feeds into like a case study of like, this is exactly how this needs to happen. And scenarios that will be sent to the vendors, the scenarios that will fit exactly what that business is doing. And there's only one way to assess that, because if you just send out an RFP, everyone's going to say they can do it. Or, you know, in some way maybe they can, but not well, or not in a way that is intuitive, or not without an enormous amount of customization. So giving them those scenarios and, maybe only a couple weeks or 3 weeks to prepare means that you're going to see exactly what that's going to look like for your business within reason, because yeah, the project exists for a reason as well, which is to create those customizations, integrations, and all the rest of it. So there's some imagination that can be used, but again, having a very clear view and being able to express in those demos like how you would get to the final product is critical. So it's critical if it's done well, but I think it's generally used as a first step, and it really should not be a first step.
Indeed. And that brings me to another thought, which is with the emergence of software as a service and the internet and everything else, are you seeing any pressure on the traditional sort of RFP approach towards more of a proof of concept type strategy? And if so, what would be your thoughts there?
Um, I think even with the SaaS vendors, there's still quite a lot of RFP activity that goes on, or traditional selection. Um, but the POC element is a really interesting one, especially for smaller trading houses where the use case is quite clear and is probably going to be filled pretty much out of the box by one of the vendors. So we've done it a few times where we have in our mind, again, we know the market very well. So rather than doing a selection for these smaller traders, quite often what we propose to them, because they also don't want to spend a ton of money in something that they view as optional, which I would argue it's not, but we can short circuit that process by just saying, well, we're pretty clear what you're going to choose in the end. So rather, could we come in and do a POC for you and show you what that would look like with the vendor, and then you can select from there. So that's something we propose in a few instances, but I would say still for the most part, the mid-size kind of trading companies, they still want to do a full robust
Right.
selection. Our RFPs were, I generally say if you don't have to do it, don't bother. Um, and rather just do the demos and so on, because it's a huge amount of extra work that doesn't really add any value quite often. You're going to exclude the people that you knew you were going to exclude anyway. If they can't even pass the RFP stage, then they were either just invited to make up numbers, or because someone insisted on their inclusion or something like that. But if you can't even put that you can possibly do it, then you shouldn't be included.
Actually, this could be a long conversation. There's so many wrinkles to this, but and I've got two more questions at least because I keep writing them down. And that would be when you do the RFP, do you come with a template? And if so, how do you avoid bias within the template from previous engagements? And how do you avoid overcomplicating the RFP for a more simple business case?
So we come into the entire process with a ton of documentation that is based on our view of what a typical trading firm in that space would do.
Yeah.
So that's everything from, process flow diagrams and so on. And the idea is that you just accelerate the process, because everyone could do this activity themselves. Left to their own devices, quite often we find they don't, but you could and should do that. It'll just take you a really long time if you don't have, this pre-made stuff that you can work off. So those documents then feed into massive Excel sheets that we have of requirements that again just short circuit the entire process. So you're likely to still need to add in some quirks that need to go into the document, but so much of it it can be if you're starting with a template, it's much faster. So it's not taken from previous clients. It's taken again from documentation. It was generic. That was about, if you're a power trader trading in, these markets, you're likely to need this type of thing. So it's more about customizing the documents than creating them from scratch, which means that we can get a very robust selection done within 6 to 8 weeks versus, you probably take 6 months at least to do it if you're, building it out yourself. So, and also in our way, the way we put it, the only bias we can introduce into the process is who we suggest you include. We'll include anyone you want to. So, you kind of remove the bias in that way. The rest is, again, customization of a standardized view of what we think people do in the market and building that out into, to the RFP and so on.
Yeah. And I guess another question that I had scribbled down as we talked was, we also have this best of breed approach available these days.
Hmm.
So rather than selecting a single supplier and a single solution,
Yeah,
you knit together an ecosystem of solutions from either the same vendor or different vendors.
yeah,
You know the situation.
yeah,
Are you able to recommend that kind of an approach? And what are the pros and cons there?
yeah. So we're actually doing a selection just like that now, funnily enough,
Right,
where they aren't even sure they need an ETRM. So they want to work out what collection of systems will actually fit the requirement.
right.
The good news is we can use the exact same approach that we have because it's so business focused and less system focused. Versus again, if you kind of tried to do it yourself and went straight to the vendors, then
Yep.
you get befuddled. So you definitely can do that. I would say most trading houses, most especially small to mid-sized trading houses, probably can just get an ETRM and maybe one or two ancillary systems that sit alongside that. I mean, you'll need data, for instance, but the risk function of a decent ETRM should be good enough for your requirements. When you get into more sophisticated, larger organizations, it becomes a lot more complex then. And then this approach of actually getting best in breed for each of the areas that you're looking at starts to make more sense. And again, then you have different budgets and higher budgets that are able to actually maintain the skill sets in each of those systems, which is no small feat,
Yep.
or managed services providers for each of those systems. The integrations to the different systems also need to be maintained. That can be internal or external, but it costs money either way. And the data policy and strategy also has to be coherent to make sure that that the data isn't siloed, that the data flows between the systems correctly, that where there are issues in it, those can be pulled out and adequately resolved in a way that doesn't take forever. If it's in one system, that's a much simpler process than if you do your valuation in like Topaz, but you have your scheduling and so on in Allegro or something. Um, there you have to really unpick it. And again, it's a more complex level of IT knowledge that's needed. So it's I think more of a fit for either non-standard use cases or larger, more complex organizations. Or the third one is, and this is particularly in the risk and valuation space, where there is either a very large degree of optionality or where the instruments that they're trading inherently have that optionality.
Right.
And therefore, again, you really need more powerful tools than your standard ETRM, can handle or can offer. Um, but it all comes at a cost, and that's necessarily a more complex and more expensive IT strategy than just having a sort of standardized system. The risk in data transformation or digital transformations and how this impacts commodity trading firms. The ETRM is critical, and again, it's such a technological niche that I feel wading in if you come from a different market is quite challenging. And you were saying earlier, actually, in most cases, people will come into this with some experience with a previous ETRM and
Yeah.
an understanding of the market, but sometimes that's also not true. I mean, a lot of the people who are going into gas and power now um, are coming from the hedge fund world because a lot of it's going algo and so on. So a lot of them really don't understand just how complex things get when you touch physical
Yeah.
energy and all of the nuance that comes into that. So, again, if left to their own devices to actually pick through that, they would miss an enormous amount of it and would wade into a project or a transformation that could really not even be damaging. It could hobble their ability to move into some of these markets at speed. And that's something that we really want to avoid. I mean, so many of these companies, again, are coming to us and saying, well, what can you get spun up in 6 months type thing. They want to move fast. And, to do that, you need to actually take some time, ironically, at the beginning to actually work out what you're trying to achieve with a system in order to build out from that and get into um, some kind of coherent ETRM structure.
So what is it about ValueCreed, given your experience in this
Yeah.
industry, that you think sets you apart?
I think every firm has a flavor. And again, I think there are some firms that do what we do that have more of a management consultancy style background who are absolutely, and I would recommend them to go in and talk strategy, talk about how you set up a new company, talk about where you have competitive advantage, stuff that we don't know. But where it comes to the application and anything related to it, you need technical knowledge, which again we have an enormous amount of. You need the functional knowledge, which again we have the experience with as well. You need a long understanding of the TRM space, and you need the experience of having done the implementations, which we have, and we only hire people that have that experience. So I think that combination is really powerful. And I think as well, it's more important from the application standpoint to have that set of skill sets than more of the kind of strategy process type knowledge. So there's that. The other piece is that as soon as you get, so you start with your business strategy, and that flows into a sort of an IT application strategy. That will then flow into implementation and support. And ideally, what you want is you want a partner who's able to actually manage that full process. And we have a very strong practice for managed services, for implementations, and so on. So people who are actually saying, well, can you help us pick the system? Often we tell them that, to look at that as a phase zero, as part of the implementation. So if you're not going to use that partner for the implementation, why use them for the selection? So I think the combination of all of those things really sets us apart. The other piece is, I mean, we typically use an offshore first model for a lot of what we do. The reason being that, frankly, we find exceptional talent in India in large numbers, and work ethic and so on. However, what we do make sure that we have in every region are experts from the market. So, the person who ran our last selection in Europe is he used to run risk for Cargill's gas and power across Europe. So he helped to select he was the lead, to do that. The person who's doing the new selection that's ongoing right now that I mentioned, that's more of an architecture review almost, he's the former chief data officer from Expo Solutions. Like, we make sure that we have those people in market who have a different perspective. That's not pure application, that's more about the actual business. So I think the way that we're structured really lends itself into the selection process.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that.